One of the things that I've encountered in working on this issue now for almost a decade is that in the culture, there's a lot of happy talk around this issue, where you hear a narrative out there in the culture, in schools, oftentimes from professionals, that says that some kids simply are trans. And if we can just allow them the space and the freedom to come out and be who they are, and affirm them, validate them, and give them the support in living as they choose to live, then basically they live happily ever after. It's not quite so simple. In working on this issue, one of the things that I think is important to recognize, and that you may have encountered in your own life, is that there is so much pain around this issue. And it's a topic of great sensitivity. And I think, unfortunately, that has led many in the church at times to not want to talk about it. But I think it's more important for us just to recognize there's pain. There's pain for those who have a child or a loved one who identifies as transgender, but then the parent is trying to retether them to reality, keep them from going down this medical path. Sometimes there's alienation in the relationships. There's also pain for those families that take the opposite course, where they choose to validate that asserted identity and walk with the person as they proceed through medical transition. There's pain there too, because there's loss. Anytime someone is professing or asserting a transgender identity, it changes relationships. It changes families. There is grief and loss, even if you think this is a good choice for them. Why? Because the person you knew, the person you loved or gave birth to, has repudiated that identity and is choosing to be someone else. So I think that's an important place to start. Presume the best of those you encounter around this issue. Because I'll tell you, again, working with parents, there are so many parents who initially start out by saying, okay, whatever makes my child happy, or I'll listen to the experts, I'm going to support this. And then they do their research or they come to question that, and yet they feel like they are being judged and accused of being bad parents. I think we really have to step back and realize this is a tough situation. There is a truth, there is a good path forward, but people need to hear that truth, and they need the love and the support to help them find their way. So I'm going to be giving my remarks mostly from a Catholic perspective, but also bringing in my public policy experience in working on this issue. So why do we talk about this issue at all? Why is it important? It's important to the culture, but certainly to the church, for two reasons in particular. There are lots of reasons, lots of things I could say about that, but two in particular that you will hear drawn out and unfolded in the course of this day are: one, the anthropological point, who we are. It matters that we as a culture get it right about who we are, because so much flows from that, and I'll talk more about that. But the second reason is that going down this medicalized path, this path of asserting an identity that's at odds with your body, causes real life harm. And the church cares about that. And we ought to care about that for everyone we encounter. So it's both aspects. And also, when you're speaking about this issue, people are in different places. One of the things I've found is that people perhaps who don't have faith, or who are coming from a certain political perspective, they don't want to hear about truth because they don't necessarily believe in truth. But if you can open their eyes to look at the facts on the ground and how this is affecting someone they love, then you've got their attention, and then you can help to show them the better path. So the fundamental question for every person in life is to figure out who we are. Because that question of identity is what determines how we answer all of the other big questions in life. It's only when we know who we are that we can figure out how I should live, what's good, what's bad, what's the meaning of suffering, what's the purpose of my life. So Christianity, and more broadly, the natural law, has for thousands of years given us the framework within which to understand that question, but also to find that answer. So who are we? And again, the speakers later today will unpack this in more detail, but I think it's important to lay this out at the beginning. So who are we? The first and most fundamental thing is that we're created. We're created by God. We're in relationship, and we're made for relationship. So we're loved by God. Our dignity comes from being created in his image and likeness and being loved by him. And that's fundamental, because in a culture that is so beset by loneliness, people don't realize they already are in relationship with someone who loves them tremendously. They don't realize that their dignity, their value, doesn't depend on whether they fit other people's expectations, whether they've got a big bank account or a great title. Their dignity comes from being a human being, someone loved and cherished by God, who's created them in his image and likeness. You can't lose that. So that's a foundational aspect of who we are. We also know that the human person is an integrated person. We're a unity of body and soul. We're not just kind of our minds, where we zip on a bodysuit or ghost in a machine, as some philosophers will talk about. We are a person, which means we are embodied persons. It's impossible to understand who we are unless we embrace the truth about our bodies. I am female. My fundamental identity is as a son or daughter of the Lord. For me, as a daughter of the Lord, but that's where everything begins. And that means, as a daughter of the Lord, I am female. So embracing that core identity as female. It means understanding that our body is something we receive as a gift from God. For those of you who are Catholic, which may be most of you, the Catechism of the Catholic Church talks about the responsibility of every person to acknowledge and accept his or her sexual identity. And that language is critical. Sexual identity. In other words, the foundational truth that we are male or female. What else do we need to know? Our body has meaning. And you'll hear Samantha talk about that in a beautiful way, and particularly how she helps unfold that for young people. But our body isn't just this tool that we use or a canvas for personal expression. Our body is integral to understanding who we are because it reveals something about ourselves. We look at the body and we realize males and females are made one for another. And that from that sexual difference, that complementarity, we know that when males and females come together in sexual intercourse, in that unity within marriage, we create new life. So marriage stands on sexual difference. What else do we know about who we are? The family, then, is based on that truth of male, female, and the child that comes from that love. We also know we're all broken. We're all inclined to sin. We have our own weaknesses. Every person in this room, nobody's perfect, and yet God doesn't leave us there. So we can love and acknowledge the hurts and the pains and the weakness that we all have, realizing that we don't have to stay there, that there is a better path. So that's, in brief, the foundational truth about who we are as persons. But we can look also to science to inform our understanding of ourselves. So Catholicism in particular is a religion of faith and reason. It's the same God who's the author of Revelation and the author of the created world that we see. So what do we know? We are created male and female. Scripture tells us that. But in science, the idea of sex is the organization towards a reproductive role. So it's whole body, whole person. It's not a question of whether you have a uterus or not, whether you have certain genitalia or not. It's your whole body's organization to either produce large gametes, ova, or sperm, Why? Because sex, sexual difference, is ordered towards reproduction. And our culture is getting very confused about the nature of sex. So you hear challenges. People will say, sex is not binary because you may have variations in people's bodies. Some males look one way, some males look another way, and then you have what people colloquially call intersex, people who have intersex conditions. It's not true. That's like a smokescreen. Step back and realize sex is related to reproduction. In the history of the world, nobody is conceived, nobody exists but for males and females coming together. So sex is binary. The idea of intersex, or the technical name disorder of sexual development, is when something goes awry, when the child is in utero. Just like you can have, one of my nieces is Down syndrome. So there was a chromosomal defect, which created also heart issues and things like that. It doesn't mean she's some other kind of person because there was a disorder in her development. In the same way, some infants, some babies, when they're in utero, there's a disorder in chromosome, genitals, the reproductive organs, that makes it, in a very small percentage of cases, ambiguous when the child is born. But the total number of people for whom there's true ambiguity is 0.02% of the population. So 99.98% of the time, a child who is born can be recognized as male or female. And even that 0.02%, those who are born with a disorder of sexual development, it's a disorder of male sexual development or female sexual development. So we have to be clear on that. There are only two sexes. It's important to know, too, you can't change sex. Why? Because who you are is genetically determined, and it's imprinted in every cell of your body. And we have about 30 trillion cells in the body. You can't change them. What happens in transition, as we'll talk more about at length, is that you change the appearance and you destroy the natural function of a person's body. You can't reproduce the function of the opposite sex. So you can't actually change sex. And I'll get into that more in the medical talk later. But this is a truth to hold on to because it's become so confused in the culture. And because when you understand that you can't change sex, you have to ask, well, why go through these medical procedures? Why introduce hormones? What's the purpose? And the short answer, but we'll unpack it later, is that this idea of transition is a promise that never delivers. You cannot escape the reality of being male or female. What else should we know? Personality traits vary by sex, but they don't determine sex. So these graphs here are based on research, global research across cultures. What they've found is that females tend to have certain personality traits and interests. Males tend to have certain personality traits or interests, but that's all it is. It's just a graphical representation of what tends to be true. A female whose interests or personality traits are more typical of, say, the average male is no less female than the girliest of girly girls. So that, too, is one of the confusions we're seeing in the culture, where people are judging that fundamental question of identity based on superficial conformity to stereotypes. What about the opposite view? When we talk about gender ideology, it's rooted in something called queer theory, and there are greater and more complex philosophical strains that I don't have time to go into. But I want to just highlight here the key beliefs that underlie gender ideology. So first, you're not a created being, you self-create. You get to define who you are. You get to determine who you are. Your identity, then, is fluid. It can shift because your feelings might shift. Your sense of self might shift. So unlike the person who receives their identity from God, gender ideology says you are like God. You get to decide who you are. Consequently, there's a rejection of human nature. When you read the theory and the research behind this, it's clear they don't believe there is something called human nature, that there are certain things that are true about human beings. So it's a complete rejection of that. Gender ideology also says that we're not integrated beings. We're not a unity of body and soul. What counts is this interior sense of who you are, your feelings, basically. So your body then is reduced to something that you can use. You can shape it, you can change it, you can make it express those feelings, but it's really not integral to who you are. Gender ideology then says when you look at the body, there's no meaning that you draw from that. And we see that now in what's called gender-inclusive puberty education for children, where at that time of life where you're trying to teach children to understand the changes they're going to go through as they mature, as a young boy becomes a man and a young girl becomes a woman. Gender-inclusive puberty education says bodies are bodies, and bodies are all different. Some girls can have vaginas, some girls can have penises, because bodies don't really matter. It's you decide who you are. And so these changes then are explained as just kind of these random things that happen because you have certain body parts, but you can get rid of those body parts if you don't like them. So the body has a reduced value. Consequently, it affects how you view sex and marriage. Sex is not this union of male and female, a self-gift, a giving of yourself in a personal way, but rather sex is simply about pleasure, because gender ideology rejects that connection between the sexed body and reproduction. So it's simply about pleasure. Doesn't matter who you're with, what you do, how many people you're with, how long you're with them for. It's really a question of your choice. My body, my choice. We've heard that slogan before. Marriage, then, is all about adult consent. It's just a relationship of convenience, companionship, not something that is designed to be fruitful and to bring forth new life. Families, then, are chosen, which means they can be unchosen. It's all a matter of choice. And then finally, instead of this understanding that every person has weaknesses, every person is marred by sin, and that we can find forgiveness and healing and grace. Instead, gender ideology says life is just about this power struggle. It's a question of who's on top, whether you're the oppressed or whether you're an oppressor. And that knowledge even is produced by power. So everything is reduced to power relationships, which is one reason why I will caution you. Some people hope that there can be some sort of compromise in dealing with gender ideology, this anthropology, this different vision of the person. There is no compromise, because those who are pushing it forward don't believe in a middle ground. They don't believe in respecting your view, the church's view. It's all about power and controlling that narrative. So gender ideology uses its own terminology. So I'm going to go through some key terms, the most important of which is gender identity. Now, you've probably heard that term. What does it mean? When you hear gender identity, think self-perception. Think feelings, because that's all it is. In fact, the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, which is one of the big lobby groups for the LGBT cause more generally, but more recently, they focus heavily on transgender issues. In their coming out guide, they define this concept of gender identity as your self-concept. In their vocabulary list for teachers to explain gender identity to children, they say gender identity is how you feel. So as a foundation for identity, it's inherently unstable. It can change. We know feelings change. Unlike sex, Sex can be determined with objective measures. Gender identity cannot. It's subject to change, and it has to be declared to be known. Why? Because it's completely interior. A couple of years ago, I was at Georgetown University for National Coming Out Day, which actually was earlier this week. And there were people walking around campus wearing t-shirts that said, "No assumptions, no judgments." And so I asked a number of them, well, could you explain that to me? And they said, literally, when you look at me, don't assume I'm female. Don't assume I'm male. No assumptions, because who I am is my gender identity. It's my inner sense. And you can't know it unless I tell you. And once I tell you, no judgments. So no assumptions, no judgments. That's gender identity, and it has unfortunately displaced sex. Even in our laws against sex discrimination are being reinterpreted to prohibit discrimination on the basis of, quote, gender identity. But again, that's just feelings that can change and that you can't perceive from the outside. Gender expression. Gender expression is simply what you do on the outside to express this feeling. You might change if you identify, let's say a female identifies as a male, she may cut her hair short, she may start wearing stereotypically male clothing, she may ask that you use male pronouns, but she also might not, because one of the contradictions here, and gender ideology is full of contradictions, is that gender expression is how you express your gender identity, but it doesn't have to match up with your gender identity. In other words, it might be how you're expressing it at the moment, but it might not. It could change, it can shift. Again, inherently unstable. So how does gender ideology deal with the fact of the body? We have a body. It does two things. It's trying to minimize its importance. So it reduces it to a mere label. You have heard that phrase, sex assigned at birth. No thinking person should use that phrase because sex is not assigned at birth. Sex is determined at conception. From a faith perspective, we know we receive that from the God who made us. But even from a purely scientific perspective, it's determined at conception. It's observed in utero or at birth. And it is immutable. It cannot change. But according to gender ideology, if you're trying to reduce the significance of sex and sexual difference, what you say is, no, that M or F that's on your birth certificate, merely a label. And so the children's books that explain this say, literally, and again, to pre-K, kindergarten, first, second graders to explain who they are, it says, when you were born, the doctor took a look at your body and made a guess as to who you are. But only you know for sure. Again, that idea that label, M or F, male or female, is simply an arbitrary designation assigned by a third party. And if you don't like that label, you can peel it off, throw it away, and stick on a new one. So that's one way of minimizing and obscuring the truth about sex. But what about the fact of the human body? That too is minimized, deconstructed. So it's reduced to anatomy, parts. So one of the things that we're seeing in medicine is some of the med school programs have been co-opted by gender ideologues, Harvard in particular, just fair warning. And so one of the things that they are teaching med students now to do is to take, when they see a patient before them, they ask their gender identity, not their sex, and then they do an anatomical inventory. What organs do you have? As if there's no logic in the world that would say females are born with a certain kind of body that's designed to produce large gametes, that's designed to gestate a person, even if something goes wrong and they don't have all those parts or they've had them removed for cancer or age or whatever it might be. Because you deny human nature, you treat the body then as just kind of this random collection of parts. So we have to inventory them. And you can replace them. You can get rid of the ones you don't like. So there's a video of a gender doc out in California, Joanna Olson Kennedy, who is not a surgeon, but she refers young girls, for example, for double mastectomies when they're identifying as males. And she was in a group, and people were saying, but wait a minute, you're referring girls 13, 14, 15 to get their breasts removed. Aren't you worried about regret? And she said, if they want breasts later, they can go get them. Fungible parts, not intrinsic to the person. And frankly, that's a lie, because you can have silicone implants, but it's not the same as having breasts that are made to nurse, et cetera. So it's a reductionist approach to sex, and then the person continues to be fragmented instead of this unity of body and soul. Desire, sexual attraction are further additional dimensions. And each of these dimensions exists on a spectrum, and they can change from day to day, hour to hour. It just all depends on the person and how they feel. So what we have is a clash of anthropologies, two incompatible visions of the human person. And again, this will be unpacked at greater length, but you have to understand that at the outset. That's not to say that people you love or people you know who are supportive of trans identities or who believe this are rejecting intentionally their Christian faith. Most people don't come at it that way, and they don't understand that this is absolutely incompatible with not just the Christian vision of the person, but the truth about the person from a scientific and natural law perspective. These two belief systems are absolutely incompatible. So where does that leave us? You might say, why are we here then? We're here because for over a decade, we have seen this ideology pushed across the globe for a variety of reasons. People often ask me, well, who's behind this? Who's making this happen? And it's really a confluence of interests. There are a variety of people who gain something by upending societal beliefs in the truth about the person, in marriage and family. You have the activists and ideologues who are true believers. They really believe that who we are is self-defined, and there's no objective truth, and the body has no meaning. There are those like Big Pharma, people in medicine, who gain something. This is an area, a growth market, where they can innovate, where there's whatever is possible according to technology should be permissible. You have governments who see this as part of their power coalition, and on and on. So there's a variety of players. The thing to know is how much money is pushing this through the culture. I often hear people say, where did this come from? It's like a tsunami hit the shores. And it's a tsunami because there's so much money behind it. So the latest figures that I have, which are now a couple of years out of date, show that about 29 million in the US is spent annually just to advocate for this agenda. Perhaps more significantly, we have recent figures about how much money is being made as a medical business, this transitioning. And it's right now over $1 billion and is projected to grow at about 11% every year. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. So it's affecting our culture in a variety of ways. Certainly the laws, creating challenges for parental rights, for religious liberty, for education, medical malpractice, conscience rights. Conscience rights are different from religious freedom. Religious freedom is the freedom to express your religion. Conscience is your typically religious, but sometimes morally based belief in that you have to do something. It's right or wrong to do something. So sometimes there's not complete overlap. But anyway, this is flooding through our legal system. On the federal level, under the Biden administration, it was started under the Obama administration, but also under various state laws and even local human rights commissions. It's changing our language. And here's why that's important. A lot of times people want to just go with the flow and say, well, what difference does it make? Language matters because it's one of the first things that someone who's trying to change what people believe hone in on. If you can change how people talk, if you can change the words they have to use to describe things, you will change their beliefs and their understandings about those things. So you look at this list of terms here that we're all now becoming used to. These terms are invented terms. They have, every word there is somehow disconnected from the truth of the person. Birthing person, as if whoever gives birth is not a female, is not a woman, is not a mother. It clouds it, it obscures the truth. So changing the language is an important aspect of this cultural change. The culture itself, particularly youth culture, is flooded because Hollywood, all the media companies, social media in particular, are deeply invested in pushing this view of the human person. And again, I know Maria and Aaron will be talking about that as well. But just realize it's like jumping into a sewer. It's unlike the world that we as adults grew up in. And that's why we can't underestimate the impact on our children, because it's one thing to be adults and to hear someone talking about a birthing person and people with ovaries. It's another thing to be a child where you're trying to figure out what's true. You're trying to make sense of things. And adults are supposed to make sense of the world for children. But when all the authority figures in your life, perhaps except your parents and maybe your pastor, are telling you things that are not true, it's really hard to sort that out as a young person. And there's a coercive element as well. We're all familiar with cancel culture. Imagine what that's like for children. I was talking to a mom who has her kids in a Catholic school, and she was talking about how in her Catholic school, when the school's not promoting this per se, but all the kids are on social media. And if someone, quote, comes out on social media, all the other kids are supposed to like, and put all these positive emojis. And if they don't, the other kids are going to be, what's the matter with you? Are you a hater? Why aren't you affirming this? So it's happening in kid world, oftentimes off the radar of parents, but it's coercive. So the three elements that will be unpacked over the course of the day, the three key influences, at least from my perspective, on children come from social media, comes from the schools, and comes from the medical and counseling professions. So again, we'll dive deeper into those. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I just want to talk to you about understanding a little bit more where the culture is on this. One of the positive things that's happened in the past year, as there has been more and more exposure of what it really means to undergo a, quote, gender transition, people are starting to realize, wait a minute, that doesn't sound like it's really good for people. Wait a minute. Can kids really make a decision to have their breasts removed or their genitals removed before they're old enough to drive? That doesn't make sense. So we're seeing a shift, especially as it's come out, particularly through COVID. COVID was a wake-up call for a lot of people because parents got a glimpse of what was happening in their kids' schools, not just public schools, but oftentimes private schools. But they got a glimpse and they realized that their kids this was being pushed on their kids, and they as parents were being kept in the dark. And that is absolutely policy across most of the school systems in this country, most of the public school systems in this country. But what we've seen is a remarkable shift where people who used to say that who you are as a man or a woman could be different from your sex, now are saying, no. Your sex determines who you are. And in particular, I was really encouraged that Catholics, who typically are kind of like everyone else, evangelicals are a lot stronger, Catholics tend to mirror the culture at large. But in the past year, we saw a change of 10% in the number of Catholics saying who you are is determined by your sex, not at some later date. It went from 52% believing that to 62%. Which is a huge jump in the world of polling. So a note of encouragement, speaking up, giving people the truth, changes minds. It's also helpful to understand what people attribute to the reasons why they change. So for people who do believe that sex determines who you are, They make up their minds looking at science, and by that I mean authentic science, not the fuzzy science like people with ovaries, science and their faith. And that doesn't mean they take the truth about the human person as male or female just as a matter of faith, but it means that their religious beliefs inform that. That might be their channel of information. So we need to realize these are the two ways that we can reach people. Even people who disagree with us, who say who you are is determined at some later date, you decide, still say they rely on science for that belief. Unfortunately, the media, their sources of information, are giving them a false science. So that's one reason why we're going to cover some of the medical aspects today. And then the other aspect for people who believe you can be whoever you want to be is they lead from a place of misplaced compassion. They know someone who identifies as transgender, and they want to love that person and affirm them, so they go with it. Instead of stepping back and saying, what's true? What does it mean to love this person? Because people we love, and ourselves included, can hold all sorts of false beliefs. And people who love them don't just rubber stamp those false beliefs, especially when they lead towards harm. Unfortunately, that's the good news as far as adults, but children are still very confused. Young people, it's 50-50, believing that sex matters. But more importantly, we now see about 21% of young people identifying as part of the LGBT community. So that aspect of knowing someone and wanting to just validate what they believe is a powerful pull on our young people. So they really do believe, I can be whoever I want to be. In a research study that came out of Pittsburgh a year ago, the number of young people identifying as transgender shot up to almost 10%, 9.2%. Historically, 15 years ago in the research, it was 0.02. And all of a sudden, it's 9.2%. That does not happen naturally. That's driven by culture. And again, that will be unpacked. So if you talk to any young person who's kind of immersed in this, chances are they're going to repeat aspects of this narrative, this idea that who I am is self-defined, that if I should listen to my peers, I'm going to be influenced by the school, that's where I'm getting my truth. So we see that as a catalyst. Then we see this belief that whatever vulnerability and pain they're experiencing can be solved by transitioning, and that's their action point. Unfortunately, it doesn't end well. So just a final note of hope, and then we'll turn over to our subsequent speakers, is that, again, there's more and more exposure. These are 3 documentaries that have just come out in the last, one's a podcast and 2 others are video documentaries that have just come out in the past couple of months. So there's more and more conversation about this. There's more and more awareness. And you will hear, we'll do our best over the next few hours to explain this in more detail, but that gives you an overview. It's a clash of anthropologies. We can do better. We have to show people there's a better way.